So I'm going to read you some quotes from Homer today. And first, though, I'm curious. Is that too loud? That's a little. Is that? You like that? Okay. All right. First, has anybody read Homer's Iliad or Odyssey or anything like that? 1, 2, 3, 4. Steve, 5. Torah, I'm sure. What's that? 10%. That's at least you're getting in there, man. You're starting it. Okay. So there's a moment. I wanted to start this off with. There's a moment when Odysseus washes up ashore a new land, and it's the name doesn't really matter, but he says a line that I think is very applicable to us here today, and to me especially. He says, "The belly's a shameless dog. There's nothing worse. Always insisting, pressing. It never lets us forget. Destroyed as I am, my heart racked with sadness, sick with anguish, still it keeps demanding. Eat, drink. It blots out all meaning of my pain, commanding, fill me up." And so, please, fill yourself up with the last 6 or 7 sausages. You guys did a good job today. This is Odysseus, the character from the Odyssey, washing ashore after he's been on trying to get home for 7 years. He washes ashore to the land of the Phaeacians. Now, at a gathering with these peoples that he comes across, he sees a bard, a storyteller named Demodocus. And it says in the Odyssey, "At once alert, Odysseus carved a strip of loin, rich and crisp with fat, from the white-tucked board that still had much meat left. And Odysseus called the herald over, and he says to him, 'Here, herald, take this choice cut to Demodocus, so he can eat his fill, with warm regards from a man who knows what suffering is. From all who walk the earth, our bards deserve esteem and awe. For the muse herself has taught them paths of songs. She loves the breed of harpers.' The herald then places the gift in Demodocus' hands, and the famous blind bard received it, overjoyed." I love imagining Homer inserting this little story into his 13,000-line epic, the Odyssey, in order to tell the people he's talking to give me, Homer, money and food. He's telling them to pay the bard. He's essentially saying, hey, give payment to those who make these events possible. And so I feel very Homeric in saying that Third Thursday costs about $250 to do. The food is now free, as you guys know. Please consider tipping at least $5 or $10, but $25 or more is much appreciated and helps us do more of these events. So that was actually my first why and my first how to read Homer. That's what I wanted to briefly talk to you guys about today. Is I've loved Homer for many, many decades now, and I think more people should read him. My first why is that he is actually applicable to many things in our daily lives, and he asks really big, important questions, as well as important on feeding yourselves and things like that. So I want you to imagine, why I chose this venue and to talk about this here is I picture thousands of years ago in the 8th century BC, a situation similar to this, where a bard comes up to a place where people are enjoying alcohol and they're reveling, and there's maybe someone playing music too loud in the other corner. And a bard walks up to this crowd and he starts to tell a story to people exactly like you. Now, this story in particular was a story that everyone there was very familiar with. He did not tell them a story they were unfamiliar with. This is not some new plot, some new thriller. It's a story that everyone knew by heart. Everyone there knew the story of Achilles and Agamemnon. Just as we all know the story of the Titanic or the major events of the founding of America or of the events of World War II. They all grew up hearing about Odysseus and his adventures. They knew the king of Troy, Priam, and his great sons, Hector and Paris. They knew about Helen and her outmatched beauty. In fact, they knew everything there was to tell about the stories. More than that, they worshipped the gods that were in the stories. So in the Iliad and the Odyssey is Zeus and Hera and all these people, all these gods. And the Greeks at that time actually worshipped those people. So they knew all about that. They believed that there was a thunder-wielding Zeus up on Mount Olympus. The story of the Trojan War was embedded in their language. If you were in ancient Greece at that time, you might hear someone in the street saying something like, well, this little tyke will grow up to be a great Ajax, as big as Ajax, or this guy is a shifty leader, kind of like Agamemnon, but not to worry, he'll get his coming. He'll get what's coming to him. So when this bard, standing in front of these alcohol imbibers, we'll just call him Homer, he had to impress them not with a unique plot, not with explosions, not with some mystery, but with the beautiful combination of elements, and I think maybe most importantly, the beautiful use of language. So the beauty of any work of art is related to the pleasure it gives us when we know it well, which is why 10% may not be enough. And the more you know Homer, the more pleasure you receive. And this is actually my first major tip on how to read Homer. You should know the story before you read the actual epic. And I'm going to actually give you a couple of little major points about this, but about the Trojan War cycle. But you can go on Amazon Prime, right? Tonight, and there's a great animated series. It goes all the way from the beginning of the origin of the gods all the way to the Trojan War cycle. And I keep saying the word Trojan War cycle. What that means is the actual myth meets with their real history, when the gods really meet with the humans, and the Greeks believed back at this time that that really happened. All these events truly took place. So there's a lot of YouTube resources. Just watch these videos. Some of them are 4, 5, 8, 9, 10 minutes. Some are 30, 40 minutes. And there's a lot of them that are a lot of fun. But that's my first tip, is know the story before you read it. Like, learn a little bit about the mythology. And it's a lot of fun. So much of the details of the Trojan War cycle is actually outside of the purview of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Iliad and the Odyssey is a work of art. The Trojan War cycle is an epic, or a big 20-year plus experience. Before the Trojan War begins, which is a 10-year war itself, and then there's 10 years afterwards, and even after that, that's all consuming the Trojan War cycle. The Iliad is a work of art that does not give you the minute-by-minute details of this war. It doesn't give you the information, the facts. What it does is it takes a few days at the end of year 9, and it tells a theme, a very important, and I think a beautiful story. So just as a couple example, we don't actually see, I'm going to spoil stuff because I've already told you I'm going to do that. So we don't see Achilles die in the Iliad, which is a famous thing we kind of know happens. I feel like this thing's getting some echo. We don't see the the Trojan horse does not happen in either the Iliad or the Odyssey. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of brief points, but I want to quiz you a little bit. Who knows how the Trojan War, and raise your hand, begins? What's the instigating event? Yeah, Brittany.
What's her face? Helen leaves Agamemnon to be at Paris.
Yes. Yes, and you said leaves, which makes me think maybe you're thinking about the movie.
No,
but
I haven't seen the movie.
I love the movie, by the way.
She either leaves or
She does leave. Yeah, so it's called the abduction of Helen generally, but she absconds. And different story, I'm only kidding, different stories tell it different ways. Some stories she left willingly, some stories she left unwillingly. I mean, I think it's more unwilling because at this time women didn't get to choose anything. So that's just the way it was. But that's the first thing, is the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, who is the wife of the Greek leader, the Greek king Menelaus. She was abducted by Trojan prince Paris. And the second thing that happens, second important event in the Trojan War cycle, is under the command of Menelaus's brother, Agamemnon, the Greeks mustered an army to go and try and get Helen back from the Trojans. This war lasted 10 years. Fighting was evenly balanced on both sides, each side having its foremost warrior. Achilles for the Greeks, Hector for the Trojans. Very important characters in the Iliad. This thing's like, hearing me. Woo. Achilles was the son of a goddess mother, Thetis, and a human father, Peleus. That's not as super important for us right now. The greatest Trojan warrior, this is important, Hector, was killed by the greatest Greek warrior, Achilles, who himself was killed by Paris. Finally, the Greeks resorted to trickery using the famous ruse of the Trojan horse, invented by whom? Who invented the Trojan horse idea? Odysseus. There you go. What's that? Steve Jobs and the Trojan horse of the iPhone? Is that what you're saying? Like maybe he just absconded from us or something? The Greeks committed... So once they finally sacked Troy, the Greeks committed many outrages against the Trojans. They were sacrilegious to the gods. Because of the sacrilegious nature of what they were doing, so for instance, they threw Hector's baby boy, Astyanax, off the towers of Troy. They did a lot of horrible things. And so what happens is, over the next 10 years, all the Greeks are punished in various ways. Most importantly, Agamemnon, the overall leader of this Greek expeditionary force, was killed by his wife and her lover when he returns. And Odysseus, as we know, or hopefully some of you know, spent 10 years trying to get home. So you basically have the important information of what you need to know to get going and entering into this world. That's it. Like, that's the big stuff. Now, I think there's more that you probably should learn a little bit. I would still watch some of those YouTube videos if you're going to try and get into this stuff. At this point, though, I've had this conversation with a lot of you, and I bet you're still asking, why should I care enough to enter this world? Like, okay, it's a cool world, but why should I care? So I'm going to give you a couple real quick reasons here. First and foremost, because this world is actually your world. A lot more than you realize. And this really should be the only reason you need to enter into this Greek world of the Iliad and the Odyssey in particular. So one of the most unique traits of the ancient Greek culture, as opposed to any other Mediterranean culture anywhere else in the world really, is their incessant and never-ending need to question everything. They question everything. The Greeks were excellent at questioning and challenging their own culture. Achilles was the embodiment of the Greek heroic warrior values. He was the best he was the Steve Jobs of his era. He was the best of the Greeks that they could produce, and he chose willingly to reject all of the values that he had been raised on and believed in for his own reasons. And he gives a reasoned argument as to why he's rejecting these. He's saying to them, giving them reasons why not to. There are no equivalents to this anywhere else in the Mediterranean or anywhere else in the world of the really challenging your own culture and your cultural values that you're raised in. So everyone who lives in the West or seeks to enjoy its wealth, prosperity, freedom, love, rationality, greatness, science, its respect for the sanctity of the individual, they should have some education in the classics. This is where, and Homer is where it all began. So I repeat, the main reason I believe you should read Homer is to see it with your own eyes and understand with your own mind a deeply ingrained and fading Western value, the questioning of your own native culture. Another value of reading great literature is the enjoyment and pleasure that you get from reading it. It is great to visit these grand eras like the Greeks, the Romans, later Spain, Italy, France, Britain. You can live vicariously through these people. This is another, I think, side but also very important issue in why you should read Homer. The pleasure, however, comes from understanding the overall text. But to understand a work of imaginative literature is very different than a work of nonfiction or what I call expository literature. So imaginative literature versus expository literature, I think, are the two fields versus I don't say fiction versus nonfiction. I say imaginative versus expository because it helps me to categorize imaginative as plays and dramas and novels and epic poetry and operas. It's everything where the creation of the art through letters, literature, comes from the imagination, purely the imagination, versus expository, which is like science and math and history, philosophy. It's anything where you're trying to convey, you're trying to talk about or explain an experience of some sort. Whereas imaginative literature, you're trying to actually directly convey or directly get someone to experience an actual thing. So when you read imaginative literature, the whole goal of it is to get you to experience that, not to think about the experience, but to really experience what it's like to be a Greek warrior. That's the whole point. Speaking from my experience as a reader, but also a teacher, I believe most of us, myself especially, deceive ourselves about our ability to read even contemporary novels intelligently. And speaking of myself, we often become tongue-tied, for instance, when asked to say what we liked about a novel or even what that novel was really about. Now, it doesn't mean we didn't enjoy it or didn't get anything out of it, but we don't have much training in that. Now, one thing is always clear to us, of course, is whether or not we liked it, but why we are pleased by it remains a mystery to many of us. And again, just try and explain why to somebody. You'll see, this happens to me all the time. We are poor articulators of our own pleasures. And this is because I think beauty is harder to analyze than truth. With expository literature, nonfiction stuff, we are concerned, like I said, primarily with conveying a factual truth. But imaginative is going to be something different. We want to experience that thing directly. Okay, so I'm going to end with this. There's other things I could go into, but I want to see if anybody has any questions. But I wanted to end with, there's a lot of do's and don'ts to reading imaginative literature in general. And so I'm applying this to Homer. But I want to actually to only tell you, and if you want, I can probably pull it up, the do's, some of the do's, but I want to tell you the number one don't when reading literature, imaginative literature. This is a do not do this. I see people do it all the time. It's like especially objectivists. So do not do this. Do not criticize imaginative literature until you have fully appreciated what the author has tried to make you experience. Do not criticize literature until you fully appreciate what the author has tried to make you experience. Now, this is a cardinal sin of aesthetic experience. It is the steel door that bars your entrance into the grand world of aesthetic pleasure. Now, by the way, I don't mean by criticize, don't write blogs, don't write reviews. I'm talking about criticizing to yourself, even. The whole goal of aesthetic experience is to let go and to let the author take you or the creator take you somewhere. Now, I want to make a note here. This is very different than saying to yourself, I don't really like this. I don't know why I don't like this, so I'm just going to move on. That's, of course, totally acceptable. Time is limited. But this is an issue of being honest with yourself. And I think this is an important training of your mechanism of enjoying aesthetic pleasure. There's nothing wrong with simply walking away from a work of art for whatever reason. Nothing wrong at all. But there is something wrong with pretending or lying to yourself that you have some kind of understanding and that your liking or disliking comes from that understanding. Because then that trains you to see those things and automatically shut off when you should be opening up. So this is how you destroy your own ability to experience art. Do not criticize until you fully appreciate what the author is trying to make you experience. You should be able to articulate what the author was attempting to make you experience and then say why he did accomplish that task or why he did not accomplish that task. Okay, so we're at the time there. If, be curious about any questions, there's a microphone over there. I do have, if anybody was curious, I had a quote from the Iliad and a poem, but I think that's going to take another 5-6 minutes. So I don't want to go too much over. I'm right at the 20 minutes. But I really want, if you want to see me after, I would love to tell a few people because the reading of it, I hope you guys will realize it's not as scary as you think, especially if you get a good translation. So I'll just end my talk on how and why to read Homer with this last caveat. Read the E.V. Ryu translation. That's this one. E-V-R-I-E-U. I got that from, what's the philosopher? Leonard Peikoff. That's Leonard Peikoff's example, and at least I heard him talk about that in one of his courses, and that's where I got. And I've read a couple translations. I really like Fagel's. There's other ones that I like. But for your first approach, I really like the E.V. Ryu, and I've done the Literary Canon Club with about 30 people now, where we read through the classics, and we started with the E.V. Ryu, Odyssey, and Iliad. All right, here we go.
Yeah. So that's a beginner question, shows how little I know about it. So two questions. Number one, the story. Is Homer just telling it, or were these stories that were told before him and he just puts them together? That's question number one. And related to that, is this fictional history, is some of the facts actually historical facts that stories are built around them? For example, the war probably did happen. I'm just curious how much true history is there and how much it's completely, just...
Yeah.
I mean, of course, the gods are real, but other than that...
No, that's a good question. So there's a lot of scholarship, and I'm not a scholar. There's a lot of scholarship on who is Homer, does he exist, is it a real person, was it ever a real person? I trust the Greeks, and their tradition was that there was an original compiler, one second, of these stories. And the stories did exist. Like I said, those stories were well known within the culture. It's an oral tradition, right? So Homer is writing on an oral tradition. That means that they would literally have several hours, a bard up there for several hours, and they would have breaks or whatever. And they even think they know where the breaks were. That's why they break up the books in certain ways. And they have several hours of this bard literally talking about, or literally telling the story. And when you read the book, even the E.V. Ryu, there's going to be a lot of epithets and repetitions, and that's remnants of that oral tradition. So Homer is the one that we attribute to putting it all together in this particular version. That's the traditional way of thinking about it. And then he or someone else wrote it down at some point. I don't know if they have any knowledge of that, but they attribute the authorship of this version to Homer. Some people, again, say that he didn't exist. It was, a committee or something like that. Like it was all these different views of what actually happened.
Characters like Agamemnon, were they actually a real person by that name that people know?
So that's a good question. I remember reading not too long ago, someone claimed to have found the tomb of Agamemnon. So there was, I think there are, there's a Mycenaean, this is the Mycenaean culture in the 11th century. That's when the Trojan War actually did happen. And there is some evidence that it was a real war of a Greek expedition. Not at all like it's portrayed in the Iliad, though. Because remember, the Iliad is the 11th century, or excuse me, the actual war is the 12th century BC. Homer is telling the story and putting this all down in the 8th century. So there's several hundred years going, and there's several hundred years of telling it over and over and over and over again. But, whether there was an actual Achilles, I don't know. I don't think so. But there were probably some, there was warriors, maybe there was someone named Achilles at some point. And again, like I said, there was a documentary, I haven't even seen it yet, but about Agamemnon's tomb. So I don't know enough details about that. But again, I think a lot of people really want to find these things, so they might be looking into it, and it's like, well, I don't know if that's really Detroit. But, it's interesting scholarship. I'm glad people are doing it. What was your other question? There was the last part of. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to make a point that
Yes.
and,
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
were like multiple Homers. Everybody could call themselves Homer, just like they could write anything for the book of Mark and say they were Mark. You know, there were no laws saying you couldn't claim to be this person.
Yeah.
That was well known.
Yeah, I mean, there's some ancient scholarship on this, and I think it's interesting. To me, it's not really that important, honestly. I mean, there's some relevance to the reading of it, but I want people just to experience the artistry of it and the beauty and the greatness of this culture that existed and founded where we are today, I think.
Hi, Kirk.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. That was fun. Wasn't that fun?
Yes.
Yeah.
For me, anyway.
I enjoyed it. I was wondering, in the description for the event, you said you first read Homer at the age of 9, and I would like to know what that's all about.
Yeah, so when I was in elementary school, and this is my experience at school in general, I was never good at anything, except maybe playing baseball. But in school, I was bad at everything. Poor grades at everything, except they said I scored this is like in third, fourth grade or something, I was 9 years old. They said I scored pretty well in reading comprehension. I'm 9-year-old, I didn't understand what that meant, but I was like, okay, so I'm good at reading. Even then I realized that. So I asked my parents, I'm a good reader, I want to read the best book that was ever written. And I asked a couple people what that was, and I heard back the Iliad and the Odyssey. So I made them go buy this for me, and my parents they didn't go to college, so they didn't know. So they got it for me, and I read it. And I remember to this day, my memory is probably wrong on this, but I remember at least going through every page and reading every page. And I remember crying the whole time because I didn't understand a word of it. And I was like, so I'm not even good at this. I'm not good at anything. And I was like, but it did spark a whole desire to want to understand this text. And, I've read it many, many times. I've listened to it, which is something I don't recommend people doing unless you've read it a couple times. But for the Fagles translation, for instance, Ian McKellen did a great reading of the Odyssey, which I really enjoyed. I think it will make very little sense to you if you have not read the story, because the languages is so different than what we have. Oh. I understand it a little bit, yeah, a little bit more. But every time I read it, I get more out of it because it's a great book.
Okay, thank you, Kirk. So actually, in regard to these works as poetry, with normal poetry, I guess, I'm used to reading it out loud because the sound of the words and the meter and so forth can really make a difference in understanding the meaning and really getting the full emotion of the piece. Is that something that you found useful with these, or is reading it more like a novel where you're presumably not reading it out loud? Does that work just fine?
Yeah, I don't recommend reading it out loud your first time, especially if you're not used to it. But remember, it is an epic poem, so it's a long poem. So that's 15,000 lines of poetry you have to read out loud. So that my goal is to get more people to read it, right? And I think, and the E.V. Ryu version that I told you about is not a verse version. It's prose. So there are prose versions where they basically translate it into prose, where it's a little bit easier to take in. And the E.V. Ryu is, again, 1950s. So it's more modern, but he still has a reverence for Greeks, which has been lost over the and there are very few people who really revere the Greeks other than me and a handful of other people. But they're kind of dying out there. But yeah, I think that's a good question. I would just recommend E.V. Ryu, start with the Iliad, the Odyssey, watch some YouTube videos. I'm always here as a resource to help out, but yeah. It's a good question, though, because I do recommend that for poetry. I knew someone was going to ask me that. I forgot. If you email me, I have a whole list of resources with links. Because again, I did the Literary Canon Club, and what we did was we read from Homer to Goethe, and we had forums. I wrote several articles to help people get more out of the reading. As, again, non-academic, just a normal person like myself trying to just enjoy this work of art. And so I do have some resources. I think if you just went Amazon Prime, Greek mythology series animated, you'll find it. But if you email me, I'll give you the whole list of stuff. Eric, then.
Hey, Kirk. So in your talk, you mentioned one of the reasons to enjoy the story is that the characters criticize the culture that they're in, and they give reasons why they do different things. Can you distinguish that from people who are critical of our culture today and distinguish them and the book from that and just being skeptical and following into nihilism?
I think I can. Let's see. That's a good question. Thank you for challenging me. So one of my favorite books in the Iliad, chapter. So we call them books in the Iliad, but it's chapter. Is book 9 of the Iliad, which is essentially Achilles. Achilles has shrugged. He has stopped fighting. It's Achilles shrugged. He has stopped fighting because his woman, his concubine essentially, was stolen from him arbitrarily by another Greek king who just happens to have more, this is Agamemnon, who happens to have brought more men with him on this expedition. So in Greek culture at that time, the more men you were able to bring, the more tribes you could muster together, the higher up on the hierarchy you were. But Achilles is actually the better fighter. He's the greatest of all fighters. What's that? Yeah, I don't know. I'm forgetting the parentage of Agamemnon. He may also be... So Achilles is not half god. He is the son of a woman, Thetis, who is a goddess. But he himself is not... He's mortal.
Oh, he's not.
So he
That's why he fights so well, isn't it?
no. No, that's... Okay. So this is a good conversation about the deathless ones and the mortal ones. And there's a whole view of that. He is able to be killed, so he is mortal. He does not have any powers. He's a very good fighter. Because he's the best fighter, he's not invulnerable. So that is something that was added way after the Homer. This is a whole other thing. He's very vulnerable, and he knows he's going to die. The most magical thing about... He becomes kind of magical at the end, but let's save that for a second. So the question Eric was asking, though, was about... Sorry, Eric, what was your question? Criticizing. So in book 9, in book 9, Achilles' woman was taken from him earlier. He has shrugged. He's no longer going to fight. And the reason is because he's not getting enough goodies, trophies, stuff. That's how you measure in this culture. This is how you measure how good you are. Right, is your what's called your kleos or your teammate, your glory and honor. That's why they fight. That's the whole cultural value. And he's the best of this in that culture. And arbitrarily, Agamemnon takes this, so he says, I'm out. Forget it. Whatever happens to you Greeks, I don't care. And they're like, well, what about your brothers fighting? And he's like, I don't care. And they even bring him, this ambassador in book 9, all these men come to him from Agamemnon, and they say, we'll give you all the riches you want. We'll give you this. We'll give you Briseis, and we'll give you her back, and every woman you could possibly imagine. So essentially what happens is they give him everything plus some of what he would have possibly wanted in this value system. And he gives them reasons why he will no longer do that, because he has now seen the arbitrary nature of his system. And he says, basically, he says, ain't no Trojan ever done me no wrong. And this is a quote that Muhammad Ali said, by the way, thousands of years later about the Viet Cong. And it's the same, quoting the same thing. But he basically realizes my life is worth more than all the treasures in Troy, is a famous line. And he gives reasoned arguments about all this. And that is very different than I think what's happening with like multiculturalism and attacks, where it's basically like, well, they'll say things like the Egyptian pharaohs were just as, in the literature, or the non-existent literature, is equivalent to the Iliad and the Odyssey, or it's just as good. And it's like, no, it's not. There's many differences. It's superior in a lot of ways. But in particular, I think the language, the integration of it all, the artistry, and this reasoned arguments for this. So yeah. Okay, anything else? I know it's about to storm, people are worried.
Do you think it's important to read the translations, or would like a modern adaptation, a modern retelling get you most of the way there, all the way there?
So I'm actually pro the modern adaptations. Like there's a Netflix series that I didn't think was amazing, but anytime there's anything Troy, I'm there. I think it's great. And I think the movie Troy is fine. I mean, I know it got a lot of flack. It's actually made by the guys who did Game of Thrones. It was their first big thing, and I love Game of Thrones. I thought they did a pretty good job. It's not at all the Iliad, and that's why they don't call it the Iliad. It's just Troy. You know, it takes place over a couple of days. The Trojan War is supposed to be a 10-year war. This is like a couple of days. It's its own telling of this ancient myth. I think they're fun, and again, it's a way for you to get some of the characters in your mind. I'm all for it. You know, I'm not stuffy about that stuff. I think I want you to get, into this story and try it out. So, all right, anything else? All right, well, thank you guys. That's my talk, and try not to get struck by lightning, by the thunder god Zeus.